All right, today's daf is Tedvav, number 15. We are at the top of Tedvav Amud Aleph on the second line where it says Gufa. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said Yurchet Gazru, Yurchet Nechliku. That it says that there were 18 issues about which Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed, with Beit Shammai overwhelming them in the voting and winning the vote and having their legislation passed. And in 18 matters, they disagreed, and apparently the disagreement stood. There was no resolution either way. But it says in the Braita Hushvu that it says that they actually agreed about the other 18 things. Not that 18 things were passed and 18 things were in disagreement, but actually 18 things were passed with Beit Shammai outvoting Beit Hillel, and 18 things were left in dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel where the vote was not resolved. But then it says that it was resolved, that they came to an agreement. So bo bayom nechlechu lemachar hushvu. What it means is that day they argued, but by the next day they came around to a compromise and they agreed on the issue. So those 18 things are a different matter. Gufat, we're going back to what we said before. Amar Rav Huna, Rav Huna says, it said in yesterday's daf that while Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, the students of Shammai and Hillel, had many, many disagreements, Shammai and Hillel themselves only had 3 disagreements. What are they? So Shammai Omer Mikav Chala, V'Hillel Omer Mikabayim. This is from Masekhet Shabbat Daf. The argument is how much dough or how much flour has to be in your dough to require you to separate challah. Not any dough immediately requires challah to be taken. Only a dough that is of a minimum quantity. So according to Shammai, the amount is 1 kav. According to Hillel, it's 2 kabim. And the Chachamim orim lo kedivrei zeh lo kedivrei zeh ela kavu mechetza. According to the Chachamim, it's 1.5 kabim. Now, where are they getting such interesting measurements from? So, basically, the Tosafot gives an explanation here. He says that the reason is from the Yerushalmi that everybody agrees that the total amount that each person received on a given day in the midbar. Because remember, when was the mitzvah of challah given in the midbar? So how much did they receive? Asirit ha'efa. Everybody got an omer la gulgolet. Okay, that's 1/10 of an ephah. 1/10 of an ephah per day is 2 kabim. The only thing is, according to Shammai, wait a second, but in the morning they had half of that, and in the afternoon they had the other half. Because it was breakfast and dinner, or lunch and dinner. So therefore, even though the total amount that each person received was kabayim, it was 2 kabim, the total amount of each meal was 1 kav. So that's why Shammai says that 1 kav is enough to require the taking of challah. Because it says, mereshit arisotechem, from your dough, and your dough means the kind of dough that you're receiving in the midbar when they're being addressed. Okay? Hillel says no, since the total amount that they would receive in the midbar on a given day was 2 kabim, that's the amount that's necessary. It has to be 2 kabim, and what we're going to see is okay. So we move on. Okay, so the Chachamim say 1.5 kabim. Now here in the Tosafot on the side, he doesn't explain what the reasoning is behind the Chachamim's opinion. It's another subject, and we're not going to get too off track and going into the details of Hilchot Challah. But the point is, Mishigdilu Amidot. From at a certain point, they increased the measurements, meaning what was once that basically the measurement now contains 20% more than it previously contained. So Amru Chameshet Riva'im Kemach Chayavin B'Challah. So in the end, what they said was 5 quarters of a log is the amount that's obligated in challah, which is what we say today. That's the amount that is required. Rabbi Yossi Omer, hey piturin, hey ve'od chayavin. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's 5 quarters of a log, meaning 1 and 1.25 logim. However, he says it has to be a little bit more than 5 logim. It can't just be exactly 5. And the reason is because he holds that after you take the challah, there has to be 5 left. He doesn't hold that, in other words, the Chachamim hold that that's the minimum amount of dough that you're working with or flour that you're working with. The Rabbi Yossi says, no, that's the amount that has to be left once you take the challah. So there has to be that plus a little bit more. Okay, now, and again, as I said, Tosafot doesn't really go into here what the basis is for the opinion of the Chachamim. He only deals with the opinions of Hillel and Shammai. So that's a story that we can go into when we get to Hilchot Challah one day. So, ve'idach. What's this? So that's the first argument between Hillel and Shammai. The first argument of Hillel and Shammai is how much dough do you have to be working with to require you to take challah. Second issue, Hillel omer melohin maim shuvim poslim et hamikveh. How much water? If you're filling a mikveh with the natural flowing water, how much water from a non-kosher for mikveh source, such as drawn water, well water, okay, or we might say water taken from the tap? How much tap water or drawn water is too much that it will invalidate a mikveh? This is talking about a mikveh that has not yet been filled. Once the mikveh has been filled, even if you add lots of mayim she'uvim, lots of drawn water, it's not going to invalidate it. But before the mikveh is filled, in other words, when you're in the process of making the mikveh, you have to make it without adding any tap water or any drawn water. So the question is how much? And he said the amount of a hin, which is 12 lug. That's what Hillel says. That's how much it takes to invalidate the mikveh. Because a person is obligated to speak in the language of his teacher. What does that mean? That the teacher of Hillel was or the teachers were Shemaya v'Avtalyon, and they had a funny way of using the word hin instead of logim. They spoke in terms of hin, which is a biblical language, and since that was the language that they used, that was the language that Hillel used when he formulated his halakha. So that's how Rashi explains it. There's another couple of explanations that are brought in the commentaries we don't have to go into, but that's the way that Hillel is understood by Rashi here. Shammai Omer, Tisha Kabin, according to Shammai, what you need is much more than that. 9 kabin, which is actually 36 lug instead of 12. So he says, in order to invalidate a mikveh, you have to have 3 times as much tap water as Hillel says you have to have. So ironically here, in both of these cases, Shammai is actually more lenient. And we always think of Beit Shammai is more stringent, and Beit Hillel is more lenient.
And
but in all these
machlokot, if there are only 3, how is it that Shammai earned the reputation of it being more...
He's a tough guy. He was tough personally. He was the kaptan in the story, right. And that's actually in this Masekhet in second parak. But the students were more conservative and stringent in their opinions. The teachers weren't, ironically. So actually, Shammai here, and we're going to see in all 3 cases, Shammai is the one who's the most lenient. So the first one, he says, unless you have 2 kabim of flour, you don't even have to take challah. Unless you have 36 log of tap water, it doesn't invalidate the mikveh. It's no problem. And we're going to see in the third case is that way as well. And said the Chachamim the Chachamim disagreed with both of them. Until 2 weavers came from the dung gate in Yerushalayim, and they testified in the name of Shemai v'Avtalyon that all it takes is 3 lugim of water that is drawn to invalidate the mikveh. So it's not 12 and it's not 36. It's only 3 that can actually invalidate the mikveh. V'kimu Chachamim et Divrehem, and the Chachamim upheld. What? Right, so that was the chidush. That's why they said, why does it mention what their profession was? Why does it mention that they came from the ashpa, from the garbage dumps? To show you that that no matter what level you are, when it comes to divrei Torah, if you have something to contribute, we take it. So they came and they said, we heard Shemaya v'Avtalyon. They said this is the halakha. So they're 2 edim. So even though they look like they're lowly people, they have a low profession, they're from nowhere, they're from they're not from any big yichus, they're not wealthy, they're not important. It doesn't matter. In Divrei Torah, somebody comes and they say, "We heard Shemaya v'Avtalyon." They said this. That's it. End of the story. So it's showing you how they were humble. They took the truth from wherever it came. And what's the third case? Third case is the first Mishnah in Masekhet Nida. Vidach Shammai Omer Kol Anshim Dayan Shatan. What this is talking about is that when a woman starts her period for that month, so the first time that she sees blood, she becomes not only prohibited to her husband, but also Time'ah. She's also impure. And in those days, if somebody was in the state of Nida, it had implications also. If you touch Tirumah, if you touch food, if you touch vessels, it makes them Tameh. So we want to know the following. This woman discovered this morning at 9 o'clock a.m. that she's in the state of Nida. So the question is, did she just become in a state of Nida? How do you know? Maybe she just discovered it right now, but maybe actually the flow started yesterday. And maybe just last night she was making some Tirumah. Or she was working with something else. She was touching things. How do you know? So Shammai says, Kol anashim Any women? Dayan Shatan. We go by the moment they discover it. We don't care about yesterday. We give you cheskat tahora. We say, you know what? Whatever you are now, that's what you are. We look at the here and now. And what does Hillel say? Hillel is the most stringent. He says, whatever the last time was that she checked herself, we assume that from that moment on, she was Tame'ah. So let's say yesterday at 9 o'clock in the morning, she checked herself and she found she was fine. And then this morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, she found that she had blood, she had dam flowing. So what do we say? Anything she touched for the last 24 hours since she last checked, Tameh.
So all three cases, it's Hillel.
Right, he's more stringent. And in fact, even if she hasn't checked for a week, let's say she checked last week, he says, even many days, she checked a week ago and found she was okay. And this morning she checked at 9 in the morning and found dam. Everything she touched the whole week, she has to be concerned. Okay? What? Tameh only for Bet HaMikdash. For the Bet HaMikdash. We're only talking about in those days when they had, pure foods and Tumah V'Tahora and Terumah and everything. We don't have it today. Today it wouldn't apply.
How do you know if your husband wants to take Terumah or the Bet HaMikdash starting?
Right. So then we have to worry. Anything that she touched the last week, we have to be careful. So we'd have to know. So
I think this is the most important, interesting thing in this Gemara. I mean, it's pretty
that Hillel and Shammai were so opposite.
Right, and that
Shammai was the lenient one.
Throughout, everywhere you see that Shammai is
right, but it's not Shammai; it's Bet Shammai.
No, but they say
right.
I believe the Gemara. No, they would say Bet Shammai. Here it's just Shammai, the original Shammai. Yeah, that's true. Shammai was tough. He was personally tough, but halachically he was apparently not that tough. A person can be personally very tough, but in halacha he's very open-minded.
Almost every other case.
Bet Shammai.
But
you're confusing Bet Shammai.
All our life, that Bet Shammai
strict. Right, but that's true. Bet Shammai is strict.
He was an architect.
Shammai and Bet Shammai, they're one and the same.
No, they're not.
I recognize they're two different entities, but they reflect the same philosophy.
No, yeah, but that's the point. Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, it talks more about this in Masekhet Eruvin, I believe. But Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, their arguments, they had many, many, many arguments, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. But Shammai and Hillel had only 3 arguments. And in all 3 of them, Shammai was the lenient one. Yeah, these are the only ones.
And so when the students
so what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says in Eruvin, it says that their Talmidim shelo shimshu et rabam kol hatzorach. Right? It says that they didn't serve their teachers enough. In other words, they didn't. Because they weren't diligent. In other words, when you minimize, how do you minimize machloket? When you really know what you're talking about. Right. There are less doubts.
Right.
So Shammai and Hillel, there were only 3 things that they had machloket. The students, it says, shelo shimshu et rabam kol tzorkam. They didn't have enough. They didn't spend enough time studying. So they were the ones that they had machloket so much.
And it sounds like it was overturned.
And it sounds like the philosophy of Shammai to be more strict ended up showing itself in the halachic approach of the students.
Right.
And the philosophy of Hillel to be, who knows how it went that way. Yeah, it's very interesting though. There's a switch around. So, but what do the Chachamim say? Chachamim are looking at the Ela me'ed mima'et al yedei mipkida lepkida mipkida lepkida mima'et al yedei al yad me'et. So basically what the Chachamim say is that it's a compromise, okay? If the last time she checked herself was within 24 hours, then we assume everything up to the last time she checked is going to be tamei. But anything before that is fine. In other words, the woman checked this morning at 9 a.m. The last time she checked was yesterday at 9 p.m. and she was okay. So anything between this time that she checked and last time is going to be not okay. We don't know the status. Okay? But let's say the last time she checked was 3 days ago. So we only go back 24 hours. We say, the last 24 hours is a safek. Everything before that, we're going to assume she was fine. That's what the Chachamim say. That's actually what the halacha is, but it's not practical today because we don't have Tumah V'Tahora in practice today. V'tuleka, were there no other arguments between Shammai and Hillel? Va'ika, Hillel omer lismoch, v'Shammai omer shelo lismoch. This is a very, very famous machloket about semicha on holidays. When people would bring a korban on a holiday to the Beit HaMikdash that required semicha, it required leaning on the korban. Okay, that was one of the parts of the process. So there was a big machloket. Do you lean on the korban or not on Yom Tov? What's the problem? You're not allowed to lean on an animal on Yom Tov. You're not supposed to make use of an animal on Shabbat or Yom Tov by leaning on it. Say again?
You just shaft him for a korban.
Right, you're allowed. Right, you're not allowed to lean on it. Right, that's true. There's an irony there, but you're not supposed to lean on it. So this was the machloket. Now here you say Shammai is the stringent one. Here he says not to lean. Okay. Now, but what do you see? You see there was another machloket. So what's the problem? So what do you mean? There's only three? Kika Amar Rav Huna. That's only when there's no machloket of other rabbis. What they mean is like this. If you look in the Mishnah, Masekhet Chagigah, it tells us that for generations, this was a machloket. In fact, this was the first machloket ever on record. In Masekhet Chagigah, it says the first machloket ever on record was about Simichan Yom Tov, leaning on korbanot on Yom Tov. Every other halakha they had definitively. For generations, they didn't have any machloket that was unresolved. The only machloket that withstood the test of time was this machloket about whether to lean on korbanot or not. The Av Bet Din and the Nasi in every generation argued about this for several generations, and it was the first machloket ever. So there we don't call that a machloket between Shammai and Hillel, because that was a machloket that they inherited from the previous generation. It was an ongoing one. It wasn't their own machloket. It was a machloket that they carried on. Yeah, they were perpetuating it. V'ha'ika, but there's one other case of machloket between Shammai and Hillel. Habotzer lagat. If somebody goes to collect grapes, and what's the purpose of taking the grapes? When they went to harvest the grapes, so Shammai Omer Huchshar, Hillel Omer Lo Huchshar. What is this talking about? We know that in order for something to be susceptible to tum'ah, it has to be that liquid touches it, and the liquid has to be a liquid that you want. So habotzer lagat, if somebody takes grapes, harvests them for the purpose of making grape juice or wine out of it. So when he harvests them, let's say some of them get squeezed in the basket and they exude some juice. So is that juice considered? Is it going to be machshir? Is it going to make those grapes susceptible to tum'ah? So really, you would think maybe they would, because there's liquid, and all you need is liquid to make something susceptible to tum'ah. But the problem is that here it's not liquid that you want, because you don't want those grapes to have any liquid squeezed out when they're in the basket. You want it to wait till it gets to the wine press, because you want every drop of that liquid to be in the wine. You don't want to waste any wine. And then when you're collecting the grapes, when you're harvesting them and they're in the basket and they get squished and you lose some juice, you didn't want to lose that juice. So that's why, according to Beit Hillel, according to Hillel, not Beit Hillel, according to Hillel, lo huchshar. That grape juice is not juice that you wanted, so it doesn't make the grapes susceptible to tum'ah. Because you didn't want the grape juice to come out at that point. You wanted it to wait for the wine press. However, Shammai says, huchshar. Shammai says that it is considered susceptible to tum'ah. Why? Because there are cases where you might end up using a sealed basket. And in a sealed basket where that grape juice is going to collect, you're not going to lose it. So since you're not going to lose the grape juice in certain cases, you might want it in those cases. And since there are situations where you're going to want the juice, therefore the juice is considered desirable. So although in most cases they would use wicker kinds of baskets where you lost the juice, and in theory since you're going to lose that juice, it's not considered that you wanted the juice to come out because you're losing it. Since there are cases where you actually collect the juice at the bottom of the basket and you're going to be able to save it, Shammai said we have to look at any juice that oozes out of grapes that you're collecting as beneficial juice, because there are some situations where it is in fact beneficial and you're going to use it. So the Gemara says, Bar minei dahahi. We didn't count that as one of the three machlokot between Hillel and Shammai. Why? Because the hatam kashatik leHillel Shammai. Because in the end, Shammai won the argument. He persuaded Hillel to agree with his stringent view, and because he persuaded Hillel to agree with his stringent view, we didn't consider that one of their three machlokot, because in the end they came to an agreement. In the other three, they never agreed. In the mikveh case, they never agreed. In the challah case, they never agreed. In the nidah case, they never agreed. But in this case of the juice that oozes out of grapes, Hillel eventually agreed to Shammai. That's why we don't count it. Yossi ben Yoezer ish Tzredav, Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim gazru tumal eretz amim v'alkalei zechuchit. We said earlier that Yossi ben Yoezer, the man of Tzredah, and Yossi ben Yochanan, the man of Yerushalayim, decreed tum'ah on the other countries, literally. Because why? Because we have a concern that other nations are not as careful about segregating their cemeteries from their regular land, and therefore, if you have dirt or something like that from some other country, from any other country outside of the Jewish area, from Syria or whatever, that we might be concerned that it contains some dead body material, and therefore it's tameh. So we had to treat it as tum'ah. So, Veha Rabbanan Dishmonim Shana Gazor. How could you say that it was Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan that made this decree? It was actually the rabbis of the last 80 years of the second Bet HaMikdash that made this gezerah. Damar Rav Kahana, because Rav Kahana said, Kishachala Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. When Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi got sick and they thought he might die, Shalachulo Rabbi sent him a message. What was the message that he sent him? He said to him, Amor lanu bet v'gimel dvarim she'amarta lanu mishum avicha. Please tell us 2 or 3 things in the name of your father. And the word lanu is she'amarta lanu. The word lanu is taken out by the bach on the side. It should just say she'amarta mishum. Things that you said in the name of your father. In other words, he was from the previous generation. He was about to die. So they said, we want to know, are there any things that you never told us, that your father taught you, that you haven't been able to tell us because we're not going to have the chance to get it anymore because you're on your way to the next world. So Shalach Lam, he said, Kach Amar Abba, that's what Abba said. Kuf Peshana Ad Shilochara Abayit, 180 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Pashtam al Chuta Rishal Yisrael. That was when the Romans initially extended their power over Israel. Peshana Ad Shilochara Abayit, 80 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Gazru Tumal Eretz Ha'amim Val Kelei Zechuchit. That was when they made the decree that earth from any non-Jewish country is considered to be tameh, and that glassware is considered to be susceptible to tum'ah, even though from the Torah it's not susceptible to tum'ah because it's not included in anywhere. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. Mem Shanat Shloch Harav Abayit, 40 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Galtala Sanhedrin B'Yashvala B'Chanuyot. The Sanhedrin was exiled from its place in Lishkat HaGazit. It no longer could sit in the Beit HaMikdash anymore. They used to have a special chamber called the Chamber of Hewn Stone, Lishkat HaGazit, where the Sanhedrin would sit, and they were exiled from that spot, and they had to sit in Chanuyot, which was another place, a less formal area. It literally means stores. And so what do you see? First of all, they asked, what point is there in mentioning? Okay, we understand your point in mentioning that the gezerah that happened 80 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. But why are you telling us that the Sanhedrin was exiled from the Chamber of Hewn Stone? Why is that important? Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, Lomar shelo danu dinei kinasot, to tell you that they could no longer judge dinei kinasot. Dinei kinasot means rules that are knas. For example, there are 2 types of halachot that the Bet Din deals with. One is regular dinei mamonot. 2 people come, one is claiming damages, tort law. One is claiming damages from the other, and the Bet Din has to adjudicate and decide who owes whom what. But there's such a thing as dinei kenasot. Dinei kenasot means where there's a penalty or a fine imposed by the Bet Din. It's not relative to the damage. In other words, if you damage somebody's property a certain amount, now you owe them that amount, you have to pay them. Or if your ox gores their ox, or whatever happens, it damages their field, you have to pay a certain amount. What happens, though, if somebody's, in certain cases, if your ox gores a slave, if your ox gores an Eved Kena'ani, so there's a fixed amount that you pay. It's called Dinei Kenasot. Dinei Kenasot is any time that the Torah tells you that there's a fixed quantity. It's not relative to the actual damage, but it's a penalty called the Knas imposed by the Bet Din. For example, Chatzi Nezek. It says that if a shor tam, if an ox that has never gored before suddenly goes wild and causes damage, we only require you to pay half of it. Chatzi nezek. Why? Because really you should be exempt, because you didn't know that wasn't a wild ox. You didn't know that you should guard it. But the Torah imposes chatzi nezek, which means half. Why is it chatzi nezek? Because it's a knas. It's a penalty to warn you, don't do this again. It's a fine. Fines we can't impose anymore when we don't have a Bet Din in Yerushalayim, or we don't have a fully functional Bet Din. So he says they couldn't judge Dinei Kenasot. But the Gemara says, wait a second. So he says, Kenasot Salka Datach. Are you serious? Dinei Kenasot, you don't have to be in Yerushalayim to do that. All you need to judge Dinei Kenasot is real semicha. So as long as they had the real chain of semicha, the real chain of ordination going from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way to the times of the second Beit HaMikdash, when it still existed, even after the times of the second Beit HaMikdash, it still existed for a while. So as long as they had that chain that people were called Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi meant that they had real semicha, as long as they had that, they were able to judge Dinei Knesset. We can't do it today. Once they switched to being Rav, instead, like Rav Yehuda and all that, then they didn't have real semicha anymore. The chain was broken because the Romans outlawed the giving of semicha. They killed everybody that had semicha. They didn't want it to continue because it gave them a certain authority. They didn't want the rabbinical authority to continue. So the semicha was eliminated. That's what you need for Dinei Knesset, is semicha. You don't have to be in Yerushalayim. You don't have to have a bet in the Lishkat HaGazit. Rather, what it means is that if they don't have their place in Yerushalayim, they cannot judge capital cases anymore. So that's why it is 80 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. 40 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. They were exiled from their position in the chamber on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, and they couldn't judge capital cases anymore. So now the Gemara says, so now our problem is that we said that Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan were the ones who decreed these gezerot on Eretz Ha'amim, on the that land, earth, from outside of Israel is tameh. But it's not true. It was from 80 years before the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Maybe you'll say they were alive at that time. No, because we know Ve'atani will end in the Braita Hillel v'Shimon Gamliel v'Shimon, that Hillel and his son Shimon, and then Gamliel and his son Shimon ben Gamliel, Na'agun Nisiutan Lifnei Habayit Me'ah Shana, that for 100 years, it should be Bifnei Habayit, that for 100 years these rabbis were the Nisi'im. Hillel, the elder Hillel, and then his son Shimon, and then Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel, and then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So this was 4 generations. It spanned 100 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash of Nisi'im. Ve'ilu Yossi ben Yoezer, Ish Tredav Yossi ben Yochanan, Havu Kadmei Tuvah. But we know that Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan were much earlier than that. If you look at Masekhet Avot, at Pirkei Avot, you'll see they were much earlier than Hillel and Shimon and Rabban Gamliel and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan were much earlier. So therefore they must have been way before 80. They definitely weren't alive 80 years before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. They were much earlier. So therefore how could it say that decree, that earth from outside of Israel is tameh, came from only 80 years before the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, when you're telling me that Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, who lived way before that, were the ones who initiated it? That what they said was, we turn to Ted Vav Amud Bet, that in the earlier decree, in other words, there was an evolution of decrees here. The first decree was that if an actual chunk of earth from outside of Israel were to touch terumah, they would burn it. They would burn the terumah. But al-avira, if it passed through the airspace, but it didn't actually touch the earth. So there's an idea of tumat ohel. In other words, if you pass over the airspace of a place that has tumat met, where there's a dead body, it can also make you tameh. They didn't go so far as to say that if something passes through the airspace, we consider it automatically tameh. But they did say if it touches the dirt, we're going to consider it tameh. And the rabbis 80 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, Gazura Avira Litlot, they took it further. They said, you know what? Just like the dirt, we're considering it Vadai Tameh. If it touches the Terumah or Korban or anything else, we're considering whatever it touches to be definitely Tameh. We're going to also say that if something passes through the airspace outside of Israel, that it's considered questionably. Litlot means we're not going to burn it, but we're not going to use it. We're going to wait for it to spoil.
It's analogous to what we talked about the Eruv in the beginning.
Yeah, the evolution. Yeah. Generations, yeah. So yeah. Doesn't go over cemeteries and things. Yeah, because of Kohanim. Are you saying that this means that everybody always agreed that earth from outside of Israel would make it tameh for sure? That the initial decree never changed. that from the very beginning, the decree was that if earth from outside of Israel touched terumah, it would be burnt. Va'amar Ilfa, but Ilfa said, Yadayim tchilat gezeratan l'srefa, Yadayim ud tchilat gezeratan l'srefa, hamideh harina lo. That Ilfa specifically said, the only gezerah that was always stringent was the gezerah of Yadayim. That if you touched terumah without washing your hands, we burn the terumah. We consider your hands, we assume your hands have some kind of tum'ah, and we assume it vadai, we assume it for sure, and we burn the terumah. But other gezerah, and that was from the very beginning of that gezerah, they always were that strict about it. That never changed. Okay? What changed? So that implies that other gezerah did change. So this gezerah of the earth from outside of Israel causing tum'ah evolved in some way. Rather, it must have been that Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, their initial gezerah was that if terumah touched earth from outside of Israel, it was litlot. It wasn't to burn the terumah. It was just that we're not going to use that terumah now. And on the airspace outside of Israel, they didn't put any gezerah. And then the rabbis, the next generation, the 80 years before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, they increased it one level. They said, you know what? We're going to take what you said about the earth being questionably tameh, and we're going to say it's definitely tameh. And they said about the airspace being nothing, we're going to say that's questionably tameh. If you pass through the airspace, you're questionably tameh. But what do you mean? In Usha already, they also had a gezerah. In other words, there was yet another stage of this gezerah that we're missing. Because, as it says in the Mishnah, al-vav sefekot, that there were 6 sefekot, sorfinet terumah, that even though it's a sefek, we still, if terumah gets involved, we burn it. What are the 6 sefekot? Al-sefek betaparas, if you have an area that you're not sure, it might have been a cemetery. You have reason to believe it might have been a cemetery, and betaparas, it was a place that they plowed over. The non-Jews plowed over it. We don't know, we have reason to believe there might have been graves there. And now they plowed over it, so we can't tell. So if the terumah goes in there, we're going to burn it, even though we're not sure. And if you have dirt that may have come from outside of Israel, okay, so we're not sure that there's a chance. In each of these cases, the safek is about whether the terumah came in contact with these things. Okay, not whether they are a beit pras. We know that it's a beit pras. It's a cemetery that was plowed over. We just don't know if the terumah came into contact with it or not. Okay, passed through it or not. Or if you have this dirt that came from outside of Israel, we're not sure if it touched the terumah or not. If you have clothing of an Ama'aretz, we presume it to be tameh because we don't consider him to be careful about tum'ah. So we assume, if you're not sure if these garments touched the terumah, we're going to declare them tameh. And if you find random vessels, we assume that they're tameh as well. If you find spittle or saliva, we're going to assume it came from a zav. And if you have a doubt about urine of a person, that even if there's urine of an animal there, we're not sure if this is urine of a person, and even if it is urine of a person, maybe it is urine from a zav. We're not sure, and if it's urine from a zav, that would be tameh. So in all of these cases where we have a safek, we still treat it as a doubt. So al vadai maga'an. Okay, if you definitely touched one of these things, safek tumatan, sorfinet tatruma. So in all of these cases, where it's a safek, whether this entity is really tameh or not, but we know that you touched it, we burn the terumah. In other words, in all of these cases, we are not sure of the status of the thing that was touched, but we are sure that the terumah touched it. Okay, so that's what it means by safek. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, af al safek mega'an b'reshut hayachid tzorfin. Even if you had one of these items in a private domain, generally the rule is that any safek about impurity in a private domain, we rule stringently. So in this case, if you had these 2 entities, you had terumah in a room, and there was also these vessels in that room, these questionable vessels that we don't know their status. Since you don't know if one had contact with the other, if it's in a private domain, we're going to be stringent as well. The rabbi said, if it's in a reshut hayachid, in a private domain, where normally we resolve questions stringently when something's in a private domain, Tolin, we're only going to be, we're going to be in Safek. We're going to hold that Truma, we're not going to use it, but we're not going to burn it. Reshut Harabim Tehorin, but if it's in a public domain, we're going to say Tehorin, that it's pure. In other words, according to the rabbis, if we're not even sure if the Truma came into contact with one of these entities, we're not going to be that strict. If it's in a private domain, we'll consider it a doubt. If it's in a public domain, and we're not even sure if contact happened between these entities, we're not going to assume the worst. Because there's two safekot. We have a safek about the identity of the entity itself, whether it's really tamei or not. And we have a safek whether there was any contact. So we're not going to be that extreme in extending the safek. So that's what the rabbis conclude here. So what do you see though? We see that this gezeran eretz ha'amim, where you have dirt that came from eretz ha'amim, it already existed in the times of, in this period of Usha. So that's yet another period of time where a gezerah was instituted. So how do we understand this? We have to develop the evolution of this gezerah further. But ushahit kinu. Okay, so what happened was that Va'amar Ula, that our Ula said, Elu vav sefekot b'ushayit kino. That Ula said these 6 sefekot, these 6 concepts here, they were all instituted in Usha. So what does that mean? Ela atu inhu. So now we have to go back and question again. That these rabbis came along and said that v'gazora gusha litlot. They said if you have definite contact with dirt from outside of Israel, we're going to consider the terumah to be in doubt. Va'avira v'lo klum. And we're going to say that on the airspace, it's nothing. Okay, v'atu Rabbanan d'shmonim shana gazura idi v'idi litlot. And then what happened was the rabbis later. So in other words, Yossi ben Yochanan and Yossi ben Yoezer started out with the most lenient version. That they said, all we're going to say is, dirt from outside of Israel is a doubt. It's a doubt. And airspace is nothing. And then the rabbis afterwards, the rabbis of the 80 years before the Beit HaMikdash came along, and they said, no, both airspace and dirt from outside of Israel are maybe tameh, maybe. And then ve'atu b'usha, and then in Usha, what do they do? Gazora gusha lisrof va'avira k'kedeka'eka'e. And then the rabbis in Usha said, we're going to take it a step further and say that now the dirt from outside of Israel is definitely tameh. And the avira, the airspace, we're still just going to consider a doubt. We're not going to make it definite. So there are 3 stages: stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And so what we see in this Mishnah here about Usha, in this Mishnah about the Takana there, where it talks about the Sfekot, is already presuming that the dirt is considered to be, if dirt were definitely known to have been from Eretz Ha'amim, it's definitely from outside of Israel, it would have been considered definitely Tameh. But since that Mishnah is talking about dirt that we don't know its identity, we don't know. So therefore we're going to say that that's why they said that it's a Safek, and they were still going to burn on the Safek.
But can you rule Tameh on Safek Sfeka? Because it was a doubt of a doubt.
No, because they said Al Vadai Maga'an. There had to be definite contact. The only safek was, is this dirt from Eretz Ha'amim? They decreed that we're going to treat dirt from outside of Israel as definitely tameh, definitely tumah, source of tumah. So once you do that, they ruled that we're going to treat it as a definite. The safek was, did it?
Right. The safek of that, I see.
Right. So then, when it's definitely tameh if it is from outside of Israel. The question is, was it really from outside of Israel or not? And it definitely touched the terumah. So it definitely touched the terumah. It definitely touched the Truma, but the question is it from outside of Israel or not? So that's only one safek. So he said, you know what, we're going to go stringently on these cases.
I mean, do we know historically what's going on when you're talking about the evolution of this?
These gezerot, yeah.
Yeah, but there's an evolution of the court, and the court's in a different place, and a different time. And what was going on that might have influenced them all of a sudden to come up with a big gezerah? Right.
No, we have some historical information, but it's spotty. There's a lot. I mean, nowadays there's a lot of academic research into the historical period of the Talmud, but it's not a. It's a lot of it's sketchy because we don't have that much documentary evidence. They didn't give. I didn't mean to quote Barack Obama. No, but it's spotty because we don't have that much documentary evidence, basically, and a lot of it is filling in with speculation. But here, basically, what the Chachamim see is that what the Gemara is showing is that there were obviously 3 stages of this Gezerah, because the Gezerah is attributed to 3 different stages of history. So in order to account for that, they think of the 3 logical possibilities of how the Gezerah could have evolved, and they assume that that's how it must have gone. Now, none of them were there actually to witness it, but they're inferring from the fact that it went through 3 stages that it must have gone through 3 stages that make sense. So therefore, they are attributing to each stage the logically reasonable version of the Gezerah that as they understood it. Now, as I misspoke in the beginning, so each one of those cases in the Mishnah is a case where the identity of the object is what's in doubt. It definitely touched terumah. So we're not sure if this is a cemetery or that was plowed over or not. We're not sure if this is dirt that came from outside of Israel or not. We're not sure of the status of these vessels or of whether these clothing of the Am Haaretz are really tamei or not. And we're not sure about where the saliva came from. We're not sure about where the urine came from. So in all of those cases, what we're not sure of is the identity of the object, and yet we're still ruling stringently. If it definitely touched terumah, we rule stringently. And if we're questioning whether it touched or not, that's where you have a machloka between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, with Rabbi Yossi saying if it's in a private domain, we're going to assume that they touched. And with the Chachamim saying in a private domain, we're going to be in doubt. And in a public domain, if we're not sure if they touched, we're going to give it the benefit of the doubt that they didn't.
And they didn't burn it. If they didn't know, right? If they didn't know for sure that it touched.
If they didn't know for sure that it touched, the Chachamim are saying we didn't burn it.
They didn't burn it, and you said they just left it to spoil. Does that mean
basically
they didn't use it for terumah?
Right, they didn't use it for terumah. If something is, if it says tolin or litzlot, the problem is that they can't. Nobody else can use it. So you have a problem. It has kedusha, so only the kohen can use it. So if there's a halachic prohibition on using it, you have what's called tali'ah, which is what they do is they just leave it till it becomes ruined.
So why not burn it? What's the big deal?
Because you're not allowed to burn truma that's actually good. So it's in case it's good, right? Whenever you're in doubt, there's something called tolin, which means we can't do anything. If you eat it, eating truma that's tamei is an isur deoraita. Burning truma that's actually tahor is also an isur deoraita. So what are you going to do? So it's tolin. Yep. So now we'll just do a little bit more, even though we're not going to be able to finish this piece till tomorrow because it goes through the entire next amud, almost the entire daf. So kalei zechuchit ma'itama guzur b'hu rabbanan. Why did the rabbis decree tum'ah on glassware, being that glassware is not mentioned in the Torah anywhere? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan said, Reish Lakish said, Ho'ilu tchilat briatan min hachol, shavinu rabbanan kechlei cheres. Since what do you make glass from? You make it from sand. So the rabbis treated it like klei cheres. They treated it like earthenware. Elamei, if that's the case, lo teilen ta'orah b'mikveh. Then that, according to that, glassware should be just like earthenware, and it shouldn't be able to become tahor by dipping it in the mikveh ever. Okay, so how do we explain? How do we learn in the Mishnah that the following items are chotzitzin bekelim? What this means is chatzitza. When you immerse something in the mikveh, it can't have anything on it that interposes between the water of the mikveh and the thing that you're trying to purify. Now, midoraita, the rules of what constitute an interposition are more lenient than midrabanan. But according to the rabbis, even something that is a small interposition, if a person is makpid on it, if they care about it, if they're concerned about it, that, like, for example, if you take a bowl or some kind of a pot that you're going to dip and it has stickers on it. So if you don't care about the sticker and you're going to leave it on anyway, you like having the sticker to remember something, so then that's mi'ut ve'ino makpid. That means you don't care about it. But most people take the stickers off. So therefore, since most people take the stickers off, and we assume that you're makpid, you don't want the sticker on there, so you have to take it off before you dip it. So the question is, what kinds of things are chotzetz? What kind of things create an interposition for different materials? So, hazevet va'amor b'chlei zechuchit. It gives 2 examples of two different kinds of tar, okay, that would be an interposition on klei zechuchit, on glassware. In other words, if there's tar, some kind of sticky substance stuck to the glass, that is something that will prevent the mikveh water from touching the glass, and it will prevent the glass vessel from becoming tahor. So the problem is, you just told me that we're treating glass like earthenware. So how can you be dipping it in the mikveh at all? How does that work? So what's the answer? That it's talking about a case where actually this is glass, but it's glass that is hollow inside and filled with lead. So the main substance is actually the lead. It's like glazed, basically. It's glazed metal. Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir says everything goes after the ma'amid. Whatever gives it substance, whatever holds it up, holds it together is what we go by. So even though there might be glass there, the fact is that the real substance of the kli, at this point, the real substance of the vessel is the metal. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, or kli zechuchit shenikivo, that if you have a glass vessel that you made a hole in it, ve'tiv letochan avar, and you put inside lead, amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Meir mitamei, chachamim betaharin. That Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said that Rabbi Meir is mitamei. He says that it's tamei, and the chachamim say it's tahor. In other words, according to Rabbi Meir, we say that it is treated in the same way as a metal vessel, not an earthenware vessel, because inside it is lead. According to the Chachamim, it's treated as an earthenware vessel, basically, where an earthenware vessel, the rule is it can only become tamei from it's under certain specific circumstances. Okay, so essentially, what the way that Rashi explains it here is he says that why is it that Rabbi Meir says that it's tamei? He says v'lo amrinan batele mitrat keli kishar keli cheres hanishbar. In other words, what we're going to say is that since you punctured a hole in it and you filled it with lead, so that according to the Chachamim, you broke the kli. You broke it. So if it was tamei before, now it's going to be tahor, because you broke it. But according to Rabbi Meir, since you filled it with lead, and now it's still being held together with the lead, it's going to be considered like it's still a whole thing. It's still a whole entity. So what do you see from that? You see, I don't know how that's going to work, but I don't know how they're thinking of it working. But avar lead. So somehow they filled it with lead. So the point is that it's not considered a broken vessel because it's being held together with the lead somehow. So Rabbi Meir holds that obviously it's not considered like you just plugged a hole in a broken vessel. It's actually considered like, since it's holding the vessel together, it's considered like one entity, and therefore it's now considered to be tamei. What's the point? That a broken vessel cannot become tamei. A broken vessel can't become tamei because a broken vessel is not subject to tumah and tahora. And in fact, by breaking a vessel, you release it from the tumah. The Chachamim say if you made a hole in it already, you broke it, and it's not subject to tumah anymore. Rabbi Meir says you fill it with lead. The fact that it's full of lead and that lead is holding it together means it's intact, and now it's subject to tumah again. And that's why he's going to say hakol olech achar ma'amid, and he would say here too that if you have a glass vessel like this that's filled with lead somehow, that it also is going to be subject to tuvah v'tahora, and you're going to be able to dip it in the mikveh under certain circumstances as well. But the Gemara is assuming right now that under normal circumstances you would not dip glass in the mikveh, as we're going to see.